Final Fantasy XIII gets a lot of hate. The soundtrack, however, is one of the game's most beloved features. Let's dive into how the OST, composed by Masashi Hamauzu, plays nicely with the game's themes, its characters, and the series' first foray into HD gaming. It's impossible for me to start this video without addressing the elephant in the Final Fantasy XIII soundtrack. In 2009, hot off the success of her debut album Spirit, UK singer Leona Lewis was tapped to perform the theme song for the English version of the game. That's right, she didn't write a new track for the game, nor did she sing something composed by Final Fantasy XIII maestro Masashi Hamauzu. Lewis was presumably offered bags of cash to license her track, My Hands, for the release of the game outside of Japan. There are 3,002 reasons why I mute My Hands every time I reach the end credits. Maybe none are more jarring than her lyrics about putting on makeup in a game in which our main characters never even change their clothes. At a surface level, the song is basic, and it fits the basic premise of Final Fantasy XIII. There's not always an easy path in life, and sometimes you have to face fate even when you don't feel ready. But come on! At that level, you could score the entire game to Tupac's All Eyes on Me, and it'd work. Fighting fate is literally the mantra of like 3/4 of Tupac's discography. Final Fantasy XIII may not explicitly feature ruminations on superhuman concepts like eco-sustainability or self-sacrifice. I'll leave that to Final Fantasy VII. But the game deserves better than My Hands. Brief side note, if you haven't watched the minute-long trailer that describes Lewis's involvement with the game, you should check it out. Among other things, you'll get to see Lewis wiggle an Xbox 360 joystick while watching cutscenes and fighting in the arcade step. Just riveting. In Japan, however, fans reach the end of the game to hear Kimi ga Iru Kara. Known in English as Because You're Here, the song is Sayumi Sugawara's lead track from her 2009 album, First Story. Even though fans tended towards disliking Sugawara's theme song too, the track was a much better fit. Thematically, it followed the style of the rest of Final Fantasy XIII's soundtrack, thanks in part to being composed by Hamauzu himself. The piano intro builds into Sugawara's vocals, which belie her age at the time. She was just 19 when she recorded the track, but the fullness of her vocals tell the story of someone whose aspirations are deeper than penning the next pop hit. Regardless of your, or my, preferred track, the FF13 theme songs are merely gatekeepers to a larger, more developed vision that has divided the Final Fantasy community in the years since the game's release. Even if you pan the game's linearity, false sense of exploration, lack of towns, or other defining JRPG features, Final Fantasy XIII is a good game, whose music elevates it to greatness. In case you're unfamiliar with Final Fantasy XIII, allow me to enlighten you. First shown at E3 2006, the game was originally part of the Fabula Nova Crystallis series. Similar to the original game's fascinations with the Warriors of Light and collecting crystals, this series was conceived to be a return to an overarching mythos. FNC eventually landed in Purgatory, with Final Fantasy Versus 13 becoming the 15th game in the series and limiting the rest of the sub-series to the Final Fantasy 13 trilogy, Final Fantasy Type 0, and a couple of mobile games. FF13's story technically continues with FF13-2. The first game itself features a resolute ending, with most of the main party living happily ever after. But the next game retcons the ending for one of the main characters, and fans are treated to a series that spanned just under a decade of development time. I can drone on about the music of the sequels. Lightning Returns Final Fantasy XIII has one of my favorite uses of music in any video game I've ever played, but I'll stick to the original game. The general plot runs something like this. On the higher planet Cocoon, gods are responsible for pretty much all of life. However, the gods of the lower planet, Pulse, end up tainting higher planet citizens, leading to a major explosion of Cocoon's populace called the Purge. Long story short, during this purge, our main characters are granted magic and a hazy glimpse of their focus, a will bestowed by the gods, or fal'Cie. They are told to destroy the world, which will awaken the creator, who will build the world anew. It might sound confusing, but it's standard fare for Final Fantasy. The world is doomed. Go save it. Plenty of folks hated the story of the game, a chief complaint being its convoluted and confusing nature. Ironically, the game was designed with fan-favorite Final Fantasy VII in mind, albeit with a greater focus on forward-facing narrative and less on extraneous world-building and side-questing, but I'll touch on that a bit later. Now that you get the gist of the game, or don't, onward with the rest of the video. I won't front like I'm some Final Fantasy purist. I haven't played all the entries in the series. Final Fantasy VIII and XII are still on my to-do list, and I didn't grow up seeing the 4 Warriors of Light crusading across my mom's 27-inch Zenith. My introduction to the series came with Final Fantasy I and II, Dawn of Souls for the Game Boy Advance. The games are certainly worth a playthrough if you're into that sort of thing, but are definitely far cries from what the series would bring to the table with the 4th game. Final Fantasy IV for the PSP and Nintendo DS is where I fell in love with the series, and is what I consider the quintessential JRPG. There's romance, wandering, and moon pudding. The excitement of seeing Cecil redeem himself or smacking Fang, no, not that Fang, with a frying pan, brought new life into the series, and I'm thankful to have stuck with playing the games ever since. Final Fantasy IV is a key entry not just in my history, but for the entire series. In the run-up to playing Final Fantasy XIII, the series as a whole was steadily inching towards grander, more cinematic features, limited only by the technology of the day. Final Fantasy VI featured a jumping narrative that saw players spend time between different parties. Final Fantasy VII was the introduction of 3D. Final Fantasy IX, which is another of my personal favorites, took the theatrics quite literally, with players partaking in a stage show that mirrors the game's primary romance between Garnet and Zidane. And Final Fantasy X heard voice acting introduced to the series, and by God was it wonderful. Another side note here, but I hate Final Fantasy III. The game was entirely enjoyable with its flexible class system until somebody decided that the final dungeon shouldn't have a save point, not even on the DS remake. But for me, Final Fantasy XIII proved more impactful than simply the jump to HD hardware. The game discussed larger themes about fate and upholding one's duty from a variety of lenses and viewpoints. Lightning isn't necessarily wrong for wanting to topple the government to save her sister, but a realization that it'll take more than her miniskirt and gun sword, shows character growth. Snow isn't crazy for wanting a happy ending in which the hero gets the girl, but it takes a level of maturity to learn that the sacrifices he makes along the way to reach that end impact more people than himself. Each of the main characters reflect different values and different aspirations that are incredibly human despite their superhuman powers. It's through the characters, and more specifically the music, that Final Fantasy XIII earns its praise. I'm Black, and I love jazz. How did Final Fantasy XIII know? Okay, that's an overgeneralization for sure, but I can appreciate Masashi Hamauzu's dip into the genre for Saz's catchphrase theme. We don't learn much about Saz throughout the game. He's a pilot and has a son named Daj, whose afro rivals that of his dad's, and he's kind of a scary cat. Unlike Lightning, Snow, Vanille, Fang, and Hope, who have storylines woven into the larger plot of the game, Saz is simply a 40-something-year-old man trying to save his son. I love Saz's character because he isn't a stereotype. I've touched on this before, but too often Japanese culture typifies black characters in a way that's conducive to stereotyping. I don't say this to downplay other stereotypes in Japanese media. Plenty of anime do the same thing with blonde-haired, blue-eyed white characters. Black characters, rare as they may be, just seem to get the short end of this development stick, possibly due to being a marginal demographic in Japan as a whole. Saz, however, exists without ever being mentioned as black. If anything, his theme song, which features a staple Hamauzu piano melody interspersed with horn sections, acoustic guitar, and hand drums, puts a dash of color into his characterization without raising questions about why there are effectively only two black guys in all of Final Fantasy XIII's fictional world. Yes, I'm looking at you, Godot. The character themes as a whole do a phenomenal job of capturing the game's narrative. On the theme for Vanille, who serves as 13's narrator, Hamauzu reverts to a simple piano tune. Though much of Vanille's storyline revolves around running from the truth, Persona 4 much, she's actually one of the most pervasive characters of the bunch. She has intimate scenes with just about all the main characters, including Sarah, who spends most of the game encased in a block of ice. Vanille is a building block from which players can learn about the game's world, and her solo piano theme reflects that. Hamauzu uses the piano as a foundation for many of his compositions. The song kicks up not only when Vanille is a focal point, but when the party experiences a transition, like after the gang helps Hope captures Eidolon. By stripping down the theme, Hamauzu relays Vanille's centrality to the game while giving the rest of the cast room to breathe and develop in their own ways. Speaking of room to breathe, the theme for Snow Villiers, our self-proclaimed hero in a do-rag, leaves little space for error. Electric guitars ring out atop shrill synths and a cantankerous bass line as Snow does something like fly his fiancée on a hoverbike through an onslaught of enemy bullets or take on an entire platoon of soldiers solo. If Saz is supposed to be a bridge to the player, who by most accounts is pretty normal, Snow is the closest thing to a superhero this game has. To counterbalance Snow's thick-headedness, Hamauzu composed Fang's theme, a swirling melody of flutes, strings, horns, and percussion that captures everything the game has to offer. Fang is pretty headstrong in her own right, but unlike Snow, she's usually not so easily deluded to think that her actions won't come without repercussions. The horn section on this track captures us, instilling a sense of impending doom despite the melody's grandiose resolution about halfway through. Okay, I want to have more to say about Hope's theme, but for the purpose of keeping this short, just know that Hope is teenage angst embodied in the silver-haired slight physique of a sheltered rich kid. He spends the first half of the game out to kill Snow, but being too damn weak to go through with it. Then, in the second half of the game, he becomes a mini Lightning, ready to fight his fate with all his might, even if his scarf and matching arm bandana suggests otherwise. The song is sad, with acoustic guitar doing much of the heavy lifting. And even when the melody tries to take a turn for the brighter, it fumbles right back into its own self-consciousness. It's a masterful theme that capitalizes on the various points of solitude throughout the game. And that brings us to Lightning. If any character undergoes a transformation during the game, it's Lightning. I mean, she's a 21-year-old soldier, ex-soldier, who uses the code name rather than her birth name, Claire, and is the only character to do so. At least I think Snow is his real name. Admittedly, it is funny to think about when Light might have decided to rebrand herself. My personal headcanon is that sometime in the 4th grade she got hooked on shonen manga and decided Light was a better name than Claire for cutting down infidels. Regardless, Lightning's transformation from overprotective big sister to realizing that she's in fact responsible for her sister's rebellious nature is just one of the many changes she undergoes throughout the story. In Chapter 5, Light learns that force isn't always the answer, as she watches Hope lose his innocence while plotting to kill Snow. In Chapter 7, Light learns that revenge isn't worth the effort after smacking Fang across the face and realizing it didn't change a thing. Even late in the game, when confronting Snow about his plans to marry Sarah, Light realizes that fighting our big dumb hero is useless, and that her time is better spent supporting someone she loves rather than tearing down her sister's happiness. Hamauzu orchestrates this with a sweeping string intro that phases out into a piano and string section before building into a triumphant finish. Lightning is the phoenix that rises time and time again. For the record, her toughness, captured elegantly on the box art, is part of why I bought the game in the first place. She's a strong-willed female character that learns to support those around her, and in turn, lean on them for help. Rounding out our character themes is Sarah's. Though she spends most of the game existing only in flashbacks or a block of crystal, the theme song for Lightning's sister is based around the game's main motif. As an added bonus, the song features the only instance of lyrics among the main cast tracks. Sung by Francis Maya, the song's lyrics are multi-pronged, playing out with Sarah addressing Snow and Light directly, as well as the rest of the cast. I do want to acknowledge another singer on the soundtrack, Mina Sakai. Sakai also lends her vocals to some of Hamauzu's soundtracks, specifically for the Sawyer Springs, Gapper Whitewood, and Will to Fight tracks. Though Sakai's songs here are limited to harmonizing and background vocals, her presence lends itself to the man versus God theme throughout the game. Lightning and the party spend much of the game running with some form of Big Brother, be that the government or a literal God, watching their every move. Sakai's haunting vocals are a constant reminder that even at the party's lowest moments, they're far from alone. As I'll dive into in a bit, the strength of Hamauzu's musical motifs is one of the soundtrack's selling points. Somber as Sarah's theme may be, Hamauzu can just as easily flip the melody into a jovial tune, as he does on In the Sky That Night, as he can transform it into a quiet prelude, as he does on the intro track. Where Hamauzu's ear shines the most is in the various stage themes and background music that play throughout the 45-hour adventure. JRPGs can fall into the trap of becoming routine. In one of my favorite games and scores of all time, Persona 4, composer Shoji Meguro works wonders to characterize each of the game's areas and themes through the soundtrack. But the melodic shifts can become predictable, making periods of text-based exposition drag out. This happens even in other Final Fantasy games, in which players are presented with a world map and the freedom to explore as far as their levels and gear allow. But even when players are able to advance to a far-off town before the game expects them to, they are often greeted with reused town music that doesn't do enough to distinguish itself from previous areas. Final Fantasy XIII nullifies that complaint by setting our cast out on an incredibly linear path that largely prevents them from revisiting areas. Though this design choice offended Final Fantasy traditionalists, it's a choice that supremely supports the game's compositions. Take March of the Dreadnoughts, an upbeat track featuring a roaming piano, shimmering bells, and a slippery string section. Its composition is equal parts man and machination. The bells add an air of rigidity to the lively violins. You first hear the song when Hope decides to pilot a Dreadnought war mech to advance through the Vile Peaks. Though Hope is far from a combat pilot, his innocence and tech savviness, which is the focal point of future games in the series, is aptly reflected in the song. Speaking of the Vile Peaks, the eponymous song for the area is just about my least favorite track on the OST, but it does its job perfectly. Rattling percussion and droning bass urges the player along as party members join and leave the group seemingly at will. It's an ominous beat that drips with uncertainty as our heroes struggle to figure out which path to saving the world will do the most good. I'll sing Hamauzu's praises here too. Players criticize the game for its lack of choice through the first 20 hours. The menu displayed a battle settings option, but players can't willfully swap their party members until Chapter 9. Again, Hamauzu's score comes to the rescue, easing the distress of not having full control by composing tracks that reflect the moods and mentalities of our sequestered heroes. When Light and Hope team up, you get the Gapper Whitewood, a song that gently reflects Light's newfound responsibility for the young Hope. Wordless vocalizing from Sakai gives the song a bit of a techno feel, until it gives way to a bumbling bass line that helps Light and Hope remain focused. Saz and Vanille, however, earn the lighthearted Sunlit Waterscape. Another of Final Fantasy XIII's vocal themes, the track is a perfect backdrop for getting away from the pair's fear of failing their focus and becoming Seath. Maya lends her vocals here as well, and paired with the thumping backbeat, I'm hard-pressed not to bop my head in sheer enjoyment. On a similarly lighthearted tip, the Yasha's Masif, while one of my favorite tracks from the OST, is a bit more jarring. For context, the first time you hear the song is after reaching a more lush and verdant section of the Arclit Steppe, the main overworld for the second half of the game. And while the composition is light and breezy with simple guitar riffs supporting a floaty clarinet melody, the song is a reminder of the mildly hilarious JRPG trope that the best time to do side quests is when the world needs saving. Realistically, you never have to go to the Yasha's Masif to complete the game. It's an entirely optional area, home to a few mission marks and a short cutscene between Hope and Vanille. The area itself, especially taken with the music, is a lovely place to spend an hour or two of game time, but it's also a reminder that while Lightning and the gang are wandering around Pulse, sheer terror is affecting Cocoon, with Primarch Daisley carefully watching over the world like a hawk. So sure, why not stop and smell the flowers? The soundtrack also isn't awash with synths. The game is set in a recognizable near future. Motorcycles can fly and anti-grav devices exist, but there are still limits to the technological advances of Cocoon. And considering the glistening, floating planetoid is paired with Pulse, which features tech closer to the Industrial Revolution than modern day, the Final Fantasy XIII OST had the temperate use of overly grand compositions. The track Those for the Purge is emblematic of Hamauzu knowing when to soften the instrumentation. The track starts as a dirge of sorts, only to progress into an almost mechanical melody, metered by the timely ringing of bells. When it plays as a theme for the military that's out to hunt the main cast, it's fitting, regimented like the soldiers in their training. Of course, halfway through, Hamauzu opens the melody for pulsating synths that climb like they're reaching for salvation. It's a tale of two songs in one, and the complex composition allows the soundtrack to mix and match pieces of tracks to perfectly suit the mood. Hamauzu touched on the idea of making catchy tunes, particularly when it comes to the battle music. For example, the likes of normal battle music ought to be fine to listen to for like 1,000 times in a single RPG, isn't it? Even when you thought like, oh cool, when you instantly heard it for the first time, if the song made you bored after listening to it about 100 times, it would become bothersome. Setting out to compose timelessly enjoyable music, Hamauzu succeeds with the main battle theme, Blinded by the Light. The multi-layered orchestrated track features competing instruments that vie for attention as players rifle through menus to optimize their battle strategy. The steady cello rhythm is a reminder to plan every move carefully, only to make a misstep and have to improvise. That's when the entire song swells into an all-out jam, the bass and percussion pushing the tempo only to be reset by the crash of a cymbal. Though Final Fantasy XIII is light on battle themes compared to its future installments, limited to a handful beyond the main song, I'm particularly partial to Fighting Fate. In contrast to the heavily string and piano melodies that favor the main cast, the music for Barthandelus, the main boss and the primary antagonist of the game, is imperial in nature. Strings are merely an accent here, the melody guided by Latin singing and heavy-handed horn sections that represent the overarching oppression from the game's governing body. Fallacy like Barthandelus are the progenitors of all life on Cocoon and Pulse. The themes like Fighting Fate are a reminder that the will of the gods supersedes any victories humans might try to cobble together. At the risk of being any more long-winded, I want to stress that Final Fantasy XIII's soundtrack doesn't make up for all the game's faults. For fans who weren't into getting the game's lore and backstory from an unappealing datalog, the soundtrack meant nothing. Honestly, I never go back to read the datalog unless I'm trying to clear out the dashly exclamation point that hangs out in the menu to remind you didn't read the damn thing. Beyond that, the lack of compelling side quests or world building beyond the main characters is enough to turn off potential players. And I won't disavow those critiques. I never really had much of a reason to care about saving Cocoon since I spent so little time actively engaging with it. Sure, there are meaningful cutscenes at Hope's house and on the beach of Bodom, but they aren't enough to make saving the world feel like something worth doing. Masashi Hamauzu's music, however, is enough of a motivating factor to see the game through. He effortlessly matches the changing states of the cast and pace of the story to compel me to finish the game time and time again. Final Fantasy XIII's soundtrack is a powerhouse, leaving a positive imprint on the series' first foray into high-definition gaming.